Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Today in this very lecture, I will be explaining the axilla, right? So first of all, what is the literal meaning of the axilla? Axilla is actually a Latin word that means armpit, right? Now let me define the axilla anatomically. So axilla is the area that is connecting the upper limb and the lateral thoracic walls. Or you can might say that axilla is actually an area of transition between the upper limb and the cervical region, right? And different neurovascular structures are entering or leaving the upper limb through this axilla, right? So as you can see in this very picture, this very structure, as you can see, this green structure is actually indicating the axilla, right? So as you can see, this green structure, this axilla is an area of transition between the upper limb and the cervical region, as well as this axillary region is actually connecting the upper limb to the lateral thoracic walls, as you can see in this very structure, right? Now, what is the shape of the axilla? So axilla is actually an irregular pyramidal shaped structure, as you can see in this very picture, right? So axilla is actually a pyramidal hollow shaped structures, and different structures are passing through this axilla, right? So first of all, I will be explaining the boundaries of the axilla, and then I will be explaining the different contents of the axilla, right? So this is basically, the functional structure of the axilla, right? So as you can see in this very picture, this superior portion, as you can see, this is called what? This is called the apex. This is called what? The apex. This apex is also called axillary inlet. This is called inlet or apex, right? And different neurovascular structures are entering to the upper limb or leaving the upper limb through this apex, right? Now this apex is found by some bones, right? Now let me draw the structure of the apex, that what are the structures that are involved in the formation of the apex, right? So first of all, let me draw the first rib. So this is the first rib, and after that we have the clavicle. So let's say we have the clavicle, and posteriorly we have what? We have the scapula, right? So this very structure is actually indicating the apex. The apex is formed medially by the first rib. So we have the first rib, right? And anteriorly, the apex is formed by the clavicle. So we have the clavicle. And posteriorly, the apex is formed by the superior border of the scapula. But you should remember that this is the superior border of the scapula, right? And the apex is actually formed by the lateral border of the first rib, and the apex is anteriorly formed by the posterior aspect of the clavicle, right? So these are the three bones that are involved in the formation of the apex. Posteriorly we have the scapula, medially we have the first rib, and anteriorly we have the clavicles, right? So these three structures are actually forming the apex, right? Now we have four borders, right? We have how many borders? We have four borders of the axilla, right? So this very border, as you can see, or we would say that this very surface actually. So we have the lateral surface. lateral surface. Then this is we have the medial surface of the axilla. Right, and one we have the anterior surface of the axilla. This is actually the two-dimensional structure, and I cannot draw the three-dimensional structure on the board, right? But you should imagine that this is the anterior surface of the axilla, right? And when we have the posterior surface of the axilla, right? That is inside the board actually, right? When we have what? The posterior aspect of the axilla, right? Or the posterior surface of the axilla. The posterior surface of the axilla, right? Now, these four surfaces are formed by muscles, right? These are formed by the muscles, right? Now, in order to explain the lateral and the medial surfaces, right? Now, let me draw the sagittal section of the axillary region, right? Now, let me draw the sagittal section. Let's say that I have cut the axilla sagittally, right? I have cut the axilla sagittally, right? And now we are looking at the sagittal section of the axilla, right? Now, anteriorly, first of all, let me draw the clavicle. So let's say that this is we have the clavicle, right? And just below the clavicle, we have a muscle that is actually connected to the clavicle, and this muscle is called the subclavius muscle. This is we have the subclavius muscle. Subclavius muscle, right? And below the subclavius muscle, we have another muscle, right? And this very muscle is called the pectoralis minor muscle. The pectoralis minor muscle. Pectoralis minor muscle. Actually, both the subclavius muscle and the pectoralis minor muscle are enclosed by a fascia, right? These are enclosed by the fascia, right? This fascia is called the clavipectoral fascia, and this clavipectoral fascia then descends down to the axilla, right? To the anterior axillary fold actually. And this is called now what? Suspensory ligament. This is called what? The suspensory ligament, right? So you should remember that the suspensory ligament is the downward continuation of the clavipectoral fascia. This green structure is indicating what? The clavipectoral fascia. The clavipectoral fascia is actually the fascia that is attached to the clavicle, right? And then it is enclosing the subclavius muscle as well as the pectoralis minor muscle, and then it descends down as a suspensory ligament of the anterior axillary fold, right? So this very structure is indicating the suspensory ligament. Right? And now, anterior to all these structures, we have another muscle. Anterior to all these structures, we have a muscle, and that very muscle is called the pectoralis major muscle. Now, let me draw the pectoralis major muscle with this black color. Now, this black color is indicating the pectoralis major muscle. This is the pectoralis major muscle, right? So all these structures are basically forming the anterior axillary valve. It is forming the anterior axillary valve, right? This is basically this is the anterior axillary valve, right? So all these structures are forming the anterior axillary valve. Actually, in this sagittal section, we are actually looking to the anterior axillary valve and the posterior axillary valve, right? So all these structures are forming the anterior axillary valve, right? Now, let me draw the structures that are forming the posterior axillary valve, right? Now this is the anterior axillary valve, and on this side I will be drawing the structures that are forming the posterior axillary valve, right? So first of all, we have a muscle, right? And this very muscle is called the subclavius muscle. Actually, anterior to the scapula, we have a fossa, and we were calling that very fossa as the what? The subscapular fossa, right? And in that subscapular fossa, we have this very muscle, and this very muscle is called what? The subscapular muscle. Subscapularis, actually, muscle. Right? And then we have another muscle. This very muscle is called the teres major muscle. The teres major muscle. And then we have another muscle, right? This is actually a tendon. This is the tendon of which muscle? This is the tendon of the latissimus dorsi muscle. Latissimus dorsi. Latissimus dorsi muscle, right? So the posterior axillary valve is formed by three muscles, right? One, we have the subscapularis, then we have the teres major muscle, and then we have the latissimus dorsi muscle. All these structures are forming the posterior axillary valve. Right? Okay, so we are done with the anterior axillary valve and the posterior axillary valve, right? Now let me explain the medial axillary valve, right? Now let me explain the medial axillary valve. So the medial axillary valve is formed by, these are formed by what? First of all, let me write it that I am going to explain the medial axillary valve. Now, the medial axillary valve is formed by the superior four ribs, the superior four ribs, then the intercostal muscles that are present between the ribs, the intercostal muscles. And you should remember that we have three kinds of intercostal muscles. One, we have the what? The external intercostal muscle. Then we have the internal intercostal muscle. And then we have the innermost intercostal muscle. So we have three kinds of intercostal muscles. Innermost intercostal muscles, right? As well as the third contribution of the medial axillary valve is the serratus anterior muscle. the serratus anterior muscle, right? Now we are just remain with which valve? The lateral axillary valve, right? Now let me explain the lateral axillary valve. The lateral valve. So the lateral valve is formed by the intertubercular sulcus. The intertubercular sulcus was present in the humerus, right? So we have what? First of all, we have what? The intertubercular sulcus or the intertubercular groove. Both are same, right? We have the intertubercular groove. ATG, intertubercular groove. Intertubercular groove, right? ITG, intertubercular groove, right? Then we have the two heads of the bicep. One we have the long head of the bicep, and the second one we have the short head of the biceps, right? So the heads of the bicep muscle. Heads of bicep muscles. And then we have the third one, we have the coracobrachialis muscle. We have what? The coracobrachialis muscle, right? Okay. Then we have the base of the axilla as well, right? Then we have the base of the axilla. The base of the axilla. First of all, we have one apex, then we have one base, right? Then we have 4 axillary valves, right? So I have explained so far the apex, the 4 axillary valve, and we are just remain with the base, right? So the base is formed by the anterior axillary pole, right? The base is formed by the anterior axillary pole. This is, we have the anterior axillary pole, right? The anterior axillary fold. The anterior axillary fold is basically formed by it is formed by which muscle? It is formed by the pectoralis major muscle, right? As well as the posterior axillary fold that is formed by the latissimus dorsi muscle and the teres major muscle, right? So this is, we have the posterior axillary fold. This very fold. This is anterior and this is posterior axillary fold. So posterior axillary fold. PAF, posterior axillary fold. As well as we have the skin that is stretching between the axillary folds, right? Actually, the main the main component of the base is what? The skin that is stretching between the anterior and the posterior axillary fold, right? And the second one, we have the fascia, right? So inside the skin we have what? The fascia. So the skin and the fascia are forming the base of the axilla actually, right? Now I am going to explain the contents of the axilla, right? Now I am going to explain the contents of the axilla. That what are the structures that are forming, that are basically passing through the axilla, right? So I am going to explain what the contents. The contents of the axilla, right? So the very first content of the axilla is what? We have the axillary artery. The axillary artery first of all. Then we have the axillary vein. Then we have the cords of the brachial plexus. the cords of the brachial plexus. Then we have the nodes. We have 5 groups of nodes, right? So then we have the lymph nodes actually. So the fourth content is the lymph nodes. Right. And the last one we have fats, right? We have what? Fats, right? So these are the 5 contents of the axilla. First of all, we have axillary artery, right? When the subclavian artery crosses the lateral border of the first rib, then we are calling it the axillary artery, right? Then we are calling it was what? Axillary artery, right? And the axillary artery terminates at the teres major muscle. When it crosses the inferior border of the teres major muscle, then then it becomes the brachial artery actually, right? Similarly, in this very region we have the axillary vein, right? As well as we have the cords of the brachial plexus. The cords of the brachial plexus are actually surrounding the second part of the axillary artery, right? Right. As well as we have lymph nodes, right? We have what? We have lymph nodes in the axilla, right? We have 5 groups of lymph nodes actually, right? And then we have petty contents, right, in the axilla, right? Okay, so the axillary artery is basically divided into 3 structures by a muscle. That is what we have the pectoralis minor muscle. So the pectoralis minor muscle is actually dividing the axillary artery into 3 regions. One, we have the first part of the axillary artery. Then we have the second part of the axillary artery. The second part of the axillary artery lies just beneath the pectoralis minor muscle, right? And at this very region, at this very point, what is actually the cords of the brachial plexus are basically arranged around the second part of the axillary artery, right? And the second part of the axillary artery is actually beneath the pectoralis minor muscle, right? And the axillary artery is then giving 6 branches, and inshallah we will explain the different branches of the axillary artery. We will explain inshallah the axillary vein actually, and the brachial plexus, and some other tutorial inshallah. So that was all for today. I hope you will have enjoyed the lecture very much, and yeah, I will meet you in the next video. Take care of yourself. Bye bye. Allah Hafiz.